It was supposed to be a simple drive home after a long, exhausting week. The sun dipped behind the suburban streets of Tallahassee, Florida, casting long shadows over the quiet neighborhood. Darren Washington, a black man in his late 30s, navigated his silver SUV through the familiar roads, eager to return to his wife Maya and their 2 daughters. As an FBI agent, his job was demanding, but tonight, he just wanted to be a husband and father. Dressed casually in a navy t-shirt and jeans, Darren didn't stand out. That was how he liked it. Off-duty, he was just another resident, not the man who spent his days handling high-stakes federal cases. But something felt different today. His instincts, sharpened by years of experience, picked up an unusual tension in the air. He couldn't place it, but the uneasy feeling lingered. Then, red and blue lights flashed in his rearview mirror. A police cruiser followed him, its sirens piercing the calm evening. Darren's hands tightened on the wheel. He wasn't. Speeding hadn't run a stop sign. There was no reason for this stop. With a sigh, he pulled over, watching in the mirror as the cruiser stopped behind him, its headlights glaring into his car. A white officer stepped out, Officer Grant. Darren knew of him. He had a reputation, especially among the black community. There were whispers about his tough handling of certain people, but Darren had never personally encountered him until now. Grant walked toward the car, his posture stiff, his hand resting near his holstered gun. His eyes, filled with silent judgment, locked onto Darren. "License and registration," Grant demanded, offering no explanation for the stop. Darren exhaled slowly, reaching into the glove compartment. "Officer, may I ask why I was pulled over?" His voice remained calm, though a knot tightened in his stomach. Grant didn't answer immediately. Instead, his gaze scanned the car, searching for something. Anything. Something about this wasn't right. Grant's voice was sharp, cutting through the tense air. "Just give me your license and registration. Step out of the vehicle once you do." Darren's fingers tightened slightly around the documents before handing them over. His voice remained steady. "You still haven't answered my question." "Officer." Grant leaned in, his breath sour. "I don't need to answer your questions. Step out of the car, now." Darren's instincts screamed that this was no ordinary traffic stop. He had faced high-risk situations before. But this was different. Off-duty, without his badge or authority, he was vulnerable. He had to be careful. "I'm cooperating," Darren said, his voice controlled. "But I don't see any reason to." "Step out." Grant's expression hardened. "Out of the car. Now." The tension thickened. Darren exhaled slowly, unclipping his seatbelt. He didn't want this to escalate, but it already had. Moving deliberately, he pushed the door open and stepped onto the pavement. Grant was close, too close. Darren could see the judgment in his eyes, the unspoken assumptions. "Hands on the hood," Grant ordered, his voice edged with authority. Darren clenched his jaw but complied. Not because he feared Grant, but because he understood the danger of defiance. His palms pressed against the cool metal of his SUV as Grant circled him, looking him over like a suspect. "What's this really about?" "Officer?" Darren asked, his tone measured. Grant scoffed. "You think I don't know your type? Fancy car, nice neighborhood, but you're not fooling anyone." Darren's stomach twisted. There it was. Racism, unspoken yet loud. A prejudice he had battled. His whole life, from childhood to his years as an agent. Now it stood before him in a uniform, gripping authority like a weapon. Grant's eyes flicked to Darren's pockets. "You got anything on you? A weapon, maybe?" Darren kept his gaze steady. "I'm not armed and I'm not a threat." Grant smirked, unconvinced. "We'll see about that." The pat-down was unnecessarily forceful, a deliberate attempt to provoke. Darren remained still, knowing any reaction could be twisted against him. His mind worked rapidly, calculating his next move. Then, without warning, Grant reached for his handcuffs. "Turn around," he ordered. Darren could feel the situation, spiraling out of control. He couldn't let this continue. Slowly he turned, not in surrender but in control. His voice remained firm. "Officer, I need to show you something." Grant froze, his eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" Darren didn't move, his voice steady. "I'm an off-duty FBI agent." Reaching into his pocket, he carefully pulled out his badge, holding it up so Grant could see it clearly. "I'm not some criminal you can harass." The color drained from Grant's face. His confidence wavered, his tough exterior cracking. For the first time, he looked rattled, like he had just seen a ghost. I didn't know," Grant stammered. "You didn't ask," Darren cut in, his voice low but firm. "You just assumed." A shift happened in Grant's eyes. It wasn't authority anymore. It was fear, the kind that came from knowing a line had been crossed, one that couldn't be undone. Then the police radio inside Grant's cruiser crackled to life. The voice of the local police chief rang out, firm and direct. "Officer Grant, report to the station immediately." Darren glanced at the cruiser. The timing was no coincidence. His vehicle, like those of all FBI agents, had a security tracker. The chief had likely been alerted the moment the stop happened, and now they were stepping in before things spiraled further. Darren walked over to Grant's cruiser and picked up the radio. His voice was calm, but every word carried weight. "Chief, this is Darren Washington. I'll be filing an official complaint against Officer Grant for racial profiling and unnecessary escalation." Grant stood stiff, his hand hovering near his holster, but he didn't argue. He knew he had no defense. The chief's voice was tense. "Understood, Darren. Officer Grant will be disciplined." Darren handed the radio back without another word. He didn't wait for an apology. It wouldn't mean anything. He simply turned, got into his car and drove off, leaving Grant standing in stunned silence. But Darren knew this wasn't the end. In the days that followed, he formally reported Grant's actions to both the FBI and the local police department. His car's dashcam had recorded everything, and the evidence was undeniable. When the media got hold of the story, it spread fast. Grant's history of misconduct resurfaced, and for the first time, it couldn't be ignored. Under pressure, the department launched an internal investigation. Days later, Officer Grant was officially dismissed from the force. The news sent shockwaves through the community. People who had once been silent about their own experiences with Grant began speaking out. The police chief, now facing public scrutiny, announced reforms, including new policies to address racial bias and stricter accountability for officers. Darren's response to the injustice, calm, measured but firm, became a powerful example. A situation that could have ended in tragedy instead became a turning point. Change had begun. His actions led to real consequences, proving that no one, regardless of their position, is above the law. The firing of Officer Grant wasn't just about one man's mistake. It was a message to everyone watching that prejudice and racism would no longer be tolerated. Darren's courage and professionalism stood as a reminder of the importance of respect, accountability, and justice in a world that still had much to learn. Darren's weekend went by with a quiet hum of normalcy. Maya could sense that something had happened, but she knew Darren he wouldn't talk about work until he was ready, so she gave him space. They spent time with their daughters playing board games in the living room and taking a walk around their peaceful neighborhood. But even in the comfort of his home, Darren couldn't shake the weight of what had happened on Friday night. He replayed the interaction with Officer Grant over and over in his head, dissecting every moment on Monday morning. Darren sat in his home office, cup of coffee in hand, staring at the computer screen. He knew he needed to finalize his official report about the stop. His FBI colleagues were supportive, and the internal affairs team had already requested all the evidence. He had dashcam footage, audio recordings, his personal statement, but it wasn't just about paperwork for Darren. This was personal. He wasn't just filing a report about a police stop. He was standing up against something far more insidious. The systemic racism that had affected him and countless others for so long. As he began typing, his phone rang. It was his FBI supervisor, Agent Michael Stevens. Darren respected Michael, a white man in his 50s, who had always advocated for fairness and integrity in their division. Michael's voice came through the phone, calm but firm. "I just got off the phone with the police chief. They're launching their own internal investigation into Grant." Darren sighed, feeling a mix of relief and frustration. "That's good," he said, leaning back in his chair. "But you know as well as I do, these things don't always go anywhere, especially when it comes to a cop like Grant. He's been doing this for years and nothing's changed." "I hear you," Michael replied, his tone softening. "But this time, we're backing you up. You're not alone in this. We're making sure this doesn't get swept under the rug." Darren appreciated the sentiment, but he'd been around long enough to know that change didn't come easily, not in a system built on years of silence and complicity. He thanked Michael and ended the call, returning his focus to the report in front of him as his fingers hovered over the keyboard. He thought about how many others had been in his position, how many other black men had been harassed, humiliated and silenced because they didn't have the means or the power to fight back. He couldn't let this go unanswered. This wasn't just about him anymore, it was about all of them. Word about Darren's encounter with Officer Grant spread quickly through the community. It didn't take long for people to start talking. Darren wasn't the only one who had been pulled over by Grant. Dozens of others, black men, teenagers. Even women had their own stories to tell, stories that had been quietly shared among friends, whispered about at family gatherings, but never taken seriously by the authorities. A local coffee shop on Bannerman Road became the unofficial meeting point for people to vent their frustrations. One by one, stories of mistreatment and intimidation at the hands of Officer Grant poured out. People who had once been too afraid or too exhausted to speak up finally found the courage. Darren's stand had sparked something bigger than himself. One evening, while picking up a few things at the grocery store, Darren spotted a familiar face. Mrs. Evelyn Matthews, a long-time neighbor. She was a 70-year-old black woman who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. She greeted him with a warm smile, but there was something in her eyes, a quiet sorrow. "I heard about what happened," she said gently, pushing her cart down the aisle. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that, Darren." He nodded, appreciating her concern. "Thank you, Mrs. Matthews. But it's not just me. Grant's been doing this for years." She stopped walking and looked at him, her expression hardening. "I know," she said. "He pulled over my grandson 2 months ago, treated him like a criminal, like he didn't belong here." Her voice wavered. "He's only 16, just a kid." A fresh wave of anger surged through Darren. He had always known Grant's behavior wasn't an isolated incident, but hearing it from Mrs. Matthews made it all the more personal. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "This has to stop." Mrs. Matthews nodded firmly. "It does. And we're behind you, Darren. The whole community is." The investigation into Grant's misconduct continued to unfold, and soon the media took notice. Local news stations started covering the case, calling it a turning point for the town. Tallahassee wasn't known for making national headlines, but the racial tension bubbling beneath the surface had become impossible to ignore. Darren never expected to be at the center of it all. He wasn't seeking attention or recognition, he just wanted justice. But now, whether he liked it or not, he had become the face of a growing movement. Every day, more people reached out to him, sharing their own stories, offering support, or simply thanking him for standing up. It wasn't long before reporters started showing up at his door, asking for interviews. Darren was careful with his words. He didn't want this to become about him. He wanted the focus to stay on the issue: racial profiling and police misconduct. So when he did agree to speak with the press, he made sure to keep the conversation centered on the bigger picture. "This isn't just about one traffic stop," Darren said in an interview with a local news anchor. "It's about a pattern of behavior that's been ignored for too long. We need accountability. We need to address the systemic racism that allows officers like Grant to think they can act without consequences." That interview aired later that evening, and Darren's words struck a nerve. His message was clear. People across the city, especially those who had felt powerless for so long, finally felt seen. But not everyone was pleased. As Darren's story gained traction, resistance grew. There were officers within the department who had long protected Grant, others who shared his views. Even some influential figures in the city wanted the whole thing to disappear, fearing the backlash against law enforcement. And then, the threats started. One evening, as Darren sat on his porch, sipping his coffee and watching his daughters laugh and play in the yard, his phone buzzed with a new message. Darren stared at the message, his stomach tightening. He had expected backlash, but this was different. This was a direct threat. Later that night, he showed the text to Maya. They both agreed. It had to be reported. Darren had faced threats before, but this felt more personal. He wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. He was fighting for his family's safety. The FBI took the threat seriously, launching an investigation to trace its origin. In the meantime, Darren and Maya took extra precautions. They updated their home security system, stayed more alert, and made sure their daughters were always safe. But despite the growing tension, Darren refused to back down. He knew the fight for justice was never easy, and he was determined to see it through. A month had passed since the night of the traffic stop. The investigation into Officer Grant was nearing its conclusion. Darren had been called to testify before the police review board alongside others who had experienced similar harassment. The hearing was more than just a legal proceeding. It was a defining moment for the entire community. Sitting in the courthouse, waiting for his turn, Darren felt the weight of what was ahead. He had spent weeks preparing, gathering evidence, reviewing statements, ensuring everything was airtight. But even with all the preparation, anxiety still lingered. When his name was called, he took the stand, meeting the eyes of those who had the power to decide Grant's fate. He spoke with the steady confidence of a man who had endured more than he should have. He recounted the events of that night in sharp detail, every action, every word, every unjustified decision that led to that moment. The review board listened intently, and as Darren finished, he caught something in their expressions: a shift, realization, maybe even guilt. For the first time, it was clear. They couldn't ignore the truth any longer. The hearing stretched for hours. One by one, others came forward. Victims, witnesses, people who had been silenced for too long. Their stories painted a grim picture, one of unchecked power, racial profiling, and a system that had allowed Grant to operate without consequence. By the end of the day, the board had heard enough. A week later, the decision was made public. Officer Grant was officially fired. His misconduct, once buried, was now fully exposed. It was a victory, not just for Darren, but for every person who had been wronged and dismissed. But it wasn't just Grant who faced the consequences. The police department itself felt the impact. Officers who had turned a blind eye were now forced to reckon with their complicity. The police chief, under pressure from both the public and city officials, vowed to implement long overdue reforms. Stricter policies, greater accountability, real consequences for misconduct. For Darren, the win was bittersweet. Justice had been served, But it had come at a cost. The threats, the media attention, the strain on his family, none of that could be erased. And the story wasn't over. Days after Grant's firing, Tallahassee felt the shift. Darren's name was on the front page of the local paper. His story was no longer just a local issue. It was spreading across the state, across the country. For many, the news brought hope, a long-awaited sign that accountability was possible. But for others, it sparked anger and resentment. The firing of Officer Grant ignited heated debates across Tallahassee. Social media threads filled with arguments. Local forums were flooded with opinions. Even on the streets, people were talking. Some within the police force defended Grant, claiming he was simply doing his job and that his dismissal was nothing more than a political stunt. Others, particularly members of the black community, saw this as the beginning of long overdue change. As the conversations unfolded, Darren found himself at the center of it all. Letters arrived in his mailbox. Emails poured into his inbox. Messages from strangers. People who had faced racial profiling and police harassment but had never had the chance to speak out. To them, Darren had become more than an agent. He had become a symbol of hope. One evening, as he sat on the couch with Maya, he sifted through the letters. One in particular caught his eye. It was from a young black man named Jalen, who had been pulled over by Officer Grant a year earlier. Darren swallowed hard as he read the words. A lump formed in his throat. Maya leaned over his shoulder, reading along with him. She rested a gentle hand on his arm. "You did that," she said softly, pride filling her voice. "You showed people they can fight back." Darren nodded, exhaling slowly. "I just hope this is the beginning of something bigger." The pressure on the Tallahassee Police Department continued to grow. With Officer Grant gone, the community demanded more than just one firing. They wanted systemic change. The police chief, who had initially been hesitant to take a firm stance, was now under public scrutiny. Community leaders organized town hall meetings, calling for transparency and reform. People wanted answers. They wanted action. And though Darren had never sought the spotlight, he was asked to speak at one of the gatherings. The town hall took place at the Leon County Civic Center. By the time Darren arrived, the auditorium was packed. People of all ages and backgrounds filled the seats, eager to hear from local leaders and activists about what came next. Darren sat near the back, listening as one speaker after another took the stage. Parents spoke about their children being unfairly targeted by police. Teachers shared stories of students harassed on their way to school. Community organizers called for independent oversight of law enforcement. The testimonies were raw, painful, and all too familiar. Then, Darren's name was called. A hush fell over the room as he walked to the podium. He had spent years working behind the scenes, investigating, gathering evidence, searching for truth. But standing before a crowd, speaking about something so personal, was a different challenge entirely. Still, he knew his words mattered now, more than ever. Darren's voice echoed through the auditorium, steady and unwavering. But what happened to me isn't just about one bad officer or one traffic stop. It's about a system that has allowed people like Officer Grant to act without consequences for far too long. He scanned the crowd. Faces of all ages and backgrounds stared back at him, their expressions a mix of determination and quiet anger. When I was pulled over that night, Darren continued, I wasn't just another black man in a nice car. I was an FBI agent. Someone who knows the law, someone who knows the rights we're all supposed to have. And yet none of that mattered to Officer Grant. To him, I was guilty the moment he saw me. The room remained silent, hanging on his every word. But this isn't just about me. It's about all of us. It's about every person who has ever been made to feel small, who has ever been judged before they even had a chance to speak. It's about making sure that what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. "I'm not asking for sympathy," Darren said, his voice growing stronger. "I'm asking for change. Real change. We need to hold our police officers to a higher standard. We need accountability. And we need to make sure that no one is above the law." For a moment, there was silence. Then, applause erupted. Some stood, clapping. Others nodded, their expressions firm with agreement. Darren stepped away from the podium, a new sense of purpose settling in his chest. This fight was far from over, but for the first time, he felt like they were moving in the right direction. As the weeks turned into months, Darren's actions continued to send ripples through the community. The Tallahassee Police Department rolled out new training programs on bias and de-escalation tactics. An independent oversight committee was established to review complaints against officers. Community outreach programs were launched to rebuild trust between law enforcement and the public. Though no longer in the spotlight, Darren remained deeply involved. He worked behind the scenes, meeting with city officials, community leaders, and legal experts to ensure that these changes weren't just symbolic, they needed to be real, lasting, and effective. One afternoon, as Darren was leaving the FBI office, his phone rang. It was Michael, his supervisor. "Darren," Michael said, "just wanted to check in. How are you doing?" Darren smiled slightly. "I'm doing good, Michael. Thanks for asking. I've been hearing great things about the work you've been doing in the community," Michael continued. "You've made a real difference." Darren paused, letting the words settle. "It's been a long road," he admitted, "but I think we're finally getting somewhere." Michael chuckled. "If anyone could do it, it's you." As Darren hung up, he leaned against his car for a moment, taking in the quiet of the evening. The fight wasn't over, but they had come so far. This was no longer just about Officer Grant. It was about something bigger, a future where his daughters and the generations after them wouldn't have to live in fear. Months later, the media frenzy had died down. Tallahassee was no longer at the center of the national conversation about police reform. Life, in many ways, had returned to normal, but Darren's work was far from done. One evening, as he drove home from a late meeting, headlights appeared in his rearview mirror. At first, he thought nothing of it, but after several turns, the car was still behind him, trailing at a careful distance. As Darren drove through the quiet streets of Tallahassee, he noticed a police cruiser parked on the side of the road. The sight of the uniform stirred something deep inside him, a memory of the night that changed everything. Then, flashing lights filled his rearview mirror. For a brief moment, old instincts threatened to take over. But instead of fear, he felt calm. He knew who he was now, and no matter what happened next, he would stand his ground. The officer approached his car and spoke in a respectful, almost apologetic tone. There was no hostility, no suspicion, just a simple acknowledgement of a minor issue. Darren nodded and took in the moment. So much had changed in such a short time. The fear that once accompanied encounters like this had faded, replaced by a quiet sense of power. He drove home, knowing that while the fight was far from over, the world had shifted, even if just a little, because he had taken a stand. Darren. Washington's story was never just about one man's battle for justice. It was about a community that had come together, refusing to let injustice go unchecked. It was about dismantling a system that had allowed racial profiling to persist for far too long. In the years that followed, his daughters grew up hearing about their father's courage. They learned the importance of standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult. They understood that change was never easy, but always necessary. His legacy lived on, not just in policy changes or headlines, but in the hearts and minds of those who had been inspired by his resilience. The struggle for justice was never ending, But because of Darren, the path forward was a little clearer, and the next fight a little easier.